In 1884, a prison guard named Samuel Whitmore entered cell block 7 one final time. The man he had been feeding for 3 years was near death. But this wasn't an ordinary prisoner. This was a giant, standing 9 feet 4 inches tall. And what that giant told Whitmore in his last hours would append everything the world thought it knew about human history. According to the official record, the giant passed away from natural causes. The unofficial account says he died holding a secret that powerful men had spent decades trying to hide. Whitmore took that secret to his own grave 30 years later, never speaking publicly about what he had heard. Until now, nobody knew the full story because the documents were locked away, the photographs were destroyed, and the giant himself was wiped from history as if he had never existed. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten history and suppressed truths every week. Now, let's discuss what actually happened in that cell. Samuel Whitmore wasn't supposed to be working at the Allegheny County Jail in Pittsburgh. He was a former Union soldier who took the job after the war because he needed work and didn't ask questions. Most guards avoided cell block 7. The man kept there made them uneasy. Not because he was violent, he never was, but because looking at him reminded them that the world might not be what they had been told. The giant's name was recorded as John Robertson, though Whitmore would later learn that wasn't his real name. Robertson was arrested in 1881 on charges of vagrancy and disorderly conduct. The real reason for his arrest was simpler. He was too tall, too visible, too much evidence of something the authorities wanted hidden. When Robertson first arrived at the jail, he could barely fit through the cell door. The prison had to remove the top frame and rebuild it. His bed was 3 standard cots pushed together lengthwise. His clothes were custom, sewn by a local tailor who had been paid by the state to keep quiet about the measurements. 9 feet 4 inches, 460 pounds, hands the size of dinner plates. Whitmore was assigned to Robertson's detail because he was the only guard who treated the giant like a human being. The others would slide food trays under the door and leave. Whitmore would sit, talk, listen. Over 3 years, the two men developed something rare inside a prison: trust. Robertson told Whitmore things not all at once, not in neat, organized stories, but in fragments late at night when the rest of the cell block was quiet. He spoke about a world that existed before the one Whitmore knew, a world where men like him weren't anomalies, they were normal. He described cities with buildings that stretched higher than anything in Pittsburgh, not made of brick or wood, but of a white stone that seemed to glow in sunlight. Robertson called it marble, but unlike any marble Whitmore had seen, this stone was seamless, massive blocks fitted together so perfectly you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. No mortar, no cement, just stone on stone, held by precision and weight. The buildings weren't just tall for the sake of being tall. They were tall because the people who built them were tall. Robertson described doorways standing 12 feet high as standard, ceilings 20 feet up in residential buildings, public halls with ceilings soaring 50 or 60 feet, held up by columns as thick as oak trees. He talked about roads that ran for hundreds of miles in perfectly straight lines, connecting massive population centers that no longer appeared on any modern map. These weren't dirt paths or cobblestone streets. They were paved with the same white stone as the buildings, wide enough for 6 carriages side by side. And they never cracked, never broke apart. Some of them were still there, Robertson said, buried under modern roads. If you dug deep enough in the right places, you would find them. Whitmore thought Robertson was insane at first, a tall man with delusions, spinning fantasies to pass the time. But then Robertson started describing specific locations, places Whitmore had actually been, and the details were wrong in a way that made them right. Robertson described a great exhibition hall in Philadelphia, but not the one Whitmore knew from the Centennial Exhibition of 1876. He described an earlier structure, far larger, with a glass dome that could be seen for miles, a building that Robertson claimed had been torn down and rebuilt smaller before the official exhibition. Whitmore had heard rumors about this old, Timers who swore the exhibition grounds had been different before construction began. Foundations that seemed too large, streets that didn't line up with the official plans. Then Robertson described the Chicago World's Fair, except the fair hadn't happened yet. This was 1883. The fair wouldn't open until 1893, but Robertson described it in perfect detail. The white buildings, the massive scale, the temporary nature of the structures built to be demolished after the event. Whitmore asked how he could possibly know this. Robertson smiled. He said it wasn't a prediction, it was a repeat. The fairs weren't celebrations of progress. They were cover stories, excuses to tear down what remained of the old world and replace it with something smaller, something controllable. By early 1884, Robertson's health was failing. Prison doctors claimed it was consumption, but Whitmore knew better. The man was wasting away because the cell was killing him. The 9-foot ceilings weren't tall enough. Robertson spent his days hunched over, his spine curved from 3 years of never standing fully upright. Whitmore petitioned the warden for a transfer to a larger facility, denied. He petitioned for medical release, denied. He petitioned for basic humanitarian accommodation, denied every time. It became clear to Whitmore that Robertson wasn't just a prisoner. He was being deliberately kept in conditions designed to shorten his life. In March of 1884, Robertson collapsed in his cell. Whitmore found him on the floor, struggling to breathe, blood coming from his mouth. The prison doctor was called but took 4 hours to arrive. By then, Robertson knew he was dying. He asked Whitmore to come close. What he said next would haunt the guard for the rest of his life. Robertson began with a simple statement: the world had been reset, not once but multiple times. The civilization Whitmore knew, the one that celebrated progress and industry and the steady march of human achievement, was built on the ruins of something far greater. And the people in power knew it. He described a catastrophe that happened in the early 1800s. Hundreds, not a war, not a plague, but something environmental, a shift in the earth itself that destroyed most of the major cities and killed off a massive percentage of the population. Robertson said it happened over several years, not all at once. First came the earthquakes, not isolated tremors but rolling waves of seismic activity that lasted months. Buildings that had stood for centuries came down in days. Then came the floods, massive walls of water and mud that swept through valleys and buried entire cities under layers of sediment. Robertson said you could still see it if you knew what to look for: the first floors of old buildings that were now basements, windows half buried in mud, doors that opened onto nothing but packed earth. This wasn't gradual settling, this was rapid burial. After the physical destruction came the atmospheric changes. The sky itself seemed different. Robertson said darker, thicker, the air harder to breathe for those who were tall. His parents told him that the old world had different air, lighter, richer in something that allowed people to grow larger, live longer, heal faster. After the reset, that quality was gone. The survivors were the smaller ones, the average-sized humans who could adapt to the new conditions. The giants, the tall ones, the remnants of the old civilization, struggled. Their bodies required more of what the air no longer provided, and they were systematically hunted down. Robertson himself was born in 1831, just after the catastrophe. His parents hid him in rural Pennsylvania, keeping him away from cities, away from authorities, away from anyone who might report his existence. He grew up knowing he was different, but not understanding why until his parents told him the truth before they died. They told him about the old world, the one before the reset, where men of his height were common, where the buildings weren't just tall because they could be, but because they needed to be, where energy was free, harvested from the air itself through massive towers that dotted every major city, where travel happened not by horse or steam engine, but by technologies that the new world had deliberately forgotten. His parents had been part of the old educated class. They watched the systematic destruction of their world, libraries burned, records altered, maps redrawn, history rewritten to make the new world seem like the only world that had ever existed. And giants like Robertson were living proof that the official story was a lie, so they had to disappear. Robertson told Whitmore about the others. There had been more, many more. In the 1850s and 60s, they were rounded up under various pretenses: vagrants, criminals, freaks. Some were placed in asylums, others in prisons. A few were displayed in circuses and sideshows, turned into entertainment to discredit the truth of their existence, make them seem like aberrations, not evidence of a lost world. He described a network of families who hid giant children, keeping them in basements, in attics, in remote cabins far from towns, binding their growth with restrictive clothing and limited diets, trying desperately to keep them small enough to pass unnoticed. Most of these children didn't survive to adulthood. The ones who did lived in constant fear. Whitmore asked why go through so much effort to hide the existence of tall people? Robertson's answer was simple: because accepting that giants were once normal meant accepting that everything else might be wrong, too. The timeline, the history, the story of human civilization climbing slowly from primitive beginnings to industrial glory. All of it falls apart if you admit there was something greater before. The people in power after the reset weren't the most advanced, they were the survivors. And survivors don't build empires by admitting they're living in the ruins of a better world. They build empires by convincing everyone that this is as good as it's ever been. Progress only moves forward, never back. Robertson grew weaker as he spoke. Whitmore begged him to rest, but the giant refused. He said this was his last chance to tell someone who might actually listen, someone who might actually remember. He talked about the architecture, the massive buildings that still stood in cities across America and Europe, the ones built in a style they called Beaux Arts or neoclassical. Robertson said those buildings weren't built in the 1800s like the plaques claimed. They were remnants from before, repurposed, retrofitted, given new dates and new stories to hide their true age. He described how he'd seen it firsthand. In 1876, during the brief period before his arrest when he tried to live openly in Philadelphia, he watched construction crews working on what they called a new government building. But Robertson saw them uncovering old foundations, massive stone blocks that were already there, buried under decades of mud and sediment. The crews built on top of them, claimed the whole structure as new, and no one questioned it. He talked about the World's Fairs that were coming: Chicago in 1893, Buffalo in 1901, St. Louis in 1904. These weren't just celebrations, he said, they were erasure events. Build massive temporary cities that showcase the supposed height of modern achievement, let millions of people see them, then tear them all down within months, claiming it was always meant to be temporary. Meanwhile, destroy what was really there before and replace it with smaller, controllable versions. Whitmore asked if there was any proof, anything Robertson could point to that would convince others. The giant laughed, a wet, rattling sound. He said the proof was everywhere: in the size of the doorways in old buildings, in the height of ceilings that served no practical purpose, in the massive foundations buried beneath modern cities, in the photographs that showed different versions of the same buildings, in the mud flood layers visible in city excavations where first floors had become basements overnight. But proof didn't matter, Robertson said, because people don't want to believe they've been lied to on that scale. It's easier to call the proof a coincidence, easier to say the giant is crazy, easier to move on with life in the world as you know it. Robertson's breathing became labored. He reached out and grabbed Whitmore's arm with a grip that was still impossibly strong despite his dying state. He made Whitmore promise something: not to prove the story, not to convince the world, just to remember. To know that the official version of history is written by the ones who benefit from forgetting. He told Whitmore about one final thing: the energy towers. Before the reset, every major city had the massive structures that pulled electricity from the atmosphere and distributed it freely to the entire population. No coal, no steam, no fuel needed at all, just the natural resonance of the earth itself. Robertson described them in detail. They weren't simple poles or masts. They were architectural masterpieces built from the same white stone as everything else, rising hundreds of feet into the air. At the top was a sphere or dome made of copper or bronze polished to a mirror shine. These captured the atmospheric charge, Robertson said, drew it down through the structure and into underground channels that distributed power to every building in the city. The towers had another purpose, too. They healed. Robertson claimed his parents told him that people would gather near the towers when they were ill. The energy field they generated somehow accelerated healing broken bones, mended in days instead of weeks. Infections cleared without medicine. The old world had no need for hospitals the way the new world did, because the towers provided what the body needed to repair itself. After the reset, these towers were the first things destroyed. Some were torn down completely, their materials scattered or buried. Others were repurposed, turned into monuments or observation decks or transmission towers for the new controllable grid. The knowledge of how they actually worked was systematically erased. Anyone who tried to rebuild them or even study them too closely found themselves facing consequences: accidents, arrests, mysterious deaths. Robertson said if Whitmore ever saw a structure that seemed too tall, too ornate, too perfectly designed for no clear purpose, he should look closer, check for copper domes that had been removed. Look for underground chambers that seemed to serve no function. Notice if the building sat at an intersection of old roads or waterways. These were the telltale signs. It was probably a remnant, a tower that had been stripped of its true purpose and given a new story. The prison doctor finally arrived just before dawn. He examined Robertson briefly and declared there was nothing to be done. Whitmore asked if they could at least move him to the hospital wing. The doctor said no security risk. The official cause of death would be listed as tuberculosis complicated by gigantism, a natural death. No investigation needed. Robertson died 3 hours later. Whitmore was the only one in the cell. The giant's last words were not dramatic. He simply said, "Thank you for listening." And then he was gone. The body was removed that same day. Whitmore asked where it was being taken. He was told it was none of his concern. Later, he would learn through unofficial channels that Robertson's body had been transported to a private medical college in Philadelphia. There were rumors it was dissected, studied, then disposed of in an unmarked grave. All official records of John Robertson were sealed in 1885, his arrest record, his prison intake forms, his death certificate. All of it locked away in state archives under a restriction order that wouldn't expire for 100 years. When researchers finally gained access in 1985, most of the documents were missing. What remained had been heavily redacted. Whitmore left the prison service 6 months after Robertson's death. He tried to speak about what he'd witnessed, but no newspaper would print his story. His own family thought he'd gone mad with grief. He spent the next 30 years working odd jobs and writing everything down in private journals that he kept hidden. Those journals were discovered in 1956 by Whitmore's great-granddaughter while cleaning out an old family property in western Pennsylvania. She tried to donate them to local historical societies. Everyone refused. Too controversial, too unverifiable, too dangerous to the accepted historical narrative. The journals disappeared in 1959. The great-granddaughter claimed they were stolen from her home. Police found no evidence of a break-in. The case was closed as a loss of personal property with no leads. But fragments survived, copies made by the great-granddaughter before the originals vanished. Photocopies of photocopies passed between researchers and amateur historians who operate in the spaces where official history refuses to look. These fragments describe Robertson's final confession in detail. They include sketches Whitmore made of the giant, measurements, descriptions of his claims about the old world. Modern researchers have tried to verify parts of Robertson's story. Allegheny County Jail records from 1881 to 1884 show multiple pages missing from the prisoner logs, exactly where Robertson's intake and death would have been recorded. The gaps are obvious. Someone removed those pages. Local newspapers from the period make no mention of an unusually tall prisoner. But researchers found something else. In 1882, a Philadelphia medical journal published a brief notice seeking information about individuals of exceptional height for a comprehensive study of gigantism. The study was never published. The journal itself ceased publication in 1884. Building records from the 1870s and 1880s show something odd. Multiple structures in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and other major cities were listed as new construction, but excavation reports from time described workers uncovering existing foundations, sometimes several feet below street level. The official explanation was that these were remnants of earlier, smaller buildings, but the foundations were often larger than the new structures built on top of them. The 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia presented another mystery. Photographs from before the official opening show buildings in the background that don't appear in any later images, large structures with a distinctly different architectural style. By the time the exhibition opened to the public, those buildings were gone, replaced with smaller pavilions and gardens. Then there's the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893. Robertson had described it 9 years before it happened, in perfect detail. The official story says planning for the fair began in 1889. But city records show massive demolition projects in the Jackson Park area beginning in 1885, 8 years before the fair, and 4 years before planning supposedly started. What were they tearing down? Contemporary accounts from Chicago residents describe seeing crews demolishing structures that didn't match the official history of the area. Large buildings, well constructed, made from that same white stone Robertson had described. Local newspapers briefly mentioned the demolitions, but offered no clear explanation for why such substantial buildings were being destroyed in what was supposedly an undeveloped park area. Photographs of the exposition show something troubling. The buildings are enormous, ornate, beautifully designed, far more elaborate than temporary structures needed to be. The level of detail in the architecture, the scale of the construction, the engineering required to build them, all of it seems excessive for buildings that were meant to stand for only 6 months. And they were demolished completely within 6 months of the fair's closing. Every single building not repurposed, not preserved, demolished. More than 200 structures covering over 600 acres, all of it torn down with remarkable speed and efficiency. The official reason was they were always meant to be temporary, built from staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber. But photographs show solid construction, stone foundations, metal frameworks. These weren't flimsy temporary pavilions. Critics of the time called it wasteful, suspicious. Some asked why you would build such permanent-looking structures just to destroy them. Others questioned the timeline. How did they build so much so quickly? The official answer was American ingenuity and industrial might. But workers on the project told different stories about uncovering existing foundations, about buildings that were already partially there, just being restored and modified. These stories were dismissed as confusion or exaggeration. The most telling detail is what happened to the materials. When you demolish hundreds of buildings, you generate massive amounts of salvageable material: stone, metal, wood, glass. Enough to supply construction projects for years. But almost none of the Columbian Exposition materials entered the salvage market. Where did it all go? Official records show some was buried on site, some was dumped in Lake Michigan. The rest simply disappeared from documentation. Giant skeletons were reported found across North America throughout the 1800s. Newspapers documented dozens of discoveries 7 feet, 8 feet, some reports claiming 9 feet or more. The Smithsonian Institution was involved in many of these discoveries. The skeletons were supposedly taken for study and preservation. Today, the Smithsonian claims no such skeletons exist in their collection. They suggest the newspaper reports were exaggerations or hoaxes, but the reports were published in legitimate papers, written by credible witnesses, accompanied by measurements and sometimes photographs. Where did those skeletons go? Researchers have filed Freedom of Information requests. They've searched archive after archive. A few fragmentary remains have surfaced, a femur here, a skull there. Each time, initial measurements suggest an individual of exceptional height. Each time, further study is blocked, or the remains disappear before proper analysis can be completed. In 2003, a construction crew in Pittsburgh uncovered a sealed chamber beneath a building slated for demolition. Inside were medical specimens in preservation jars, bones, tissue samples, documentation suggesting they came from individuals of unusual size. Before researchers could properly examine the find, federal agents arrived, everything was seized, the construction company was paid for delays and told to forget what they'd found. The official explanation was that the specimens were from illegal medical experiments in the early 1900s and needed to be handled as sensitive historical materials. The specimens were never seen again. Requests for information about their current location have been denied on grounds of medical privacy and ongoing investigation. This pattern repeats. Evidence surfaces, evidence disappears, official denials follow. The cycle continues. Samuel Whitmore's story sits in this uncomfortable space between documented fact and suppressed truth. We know he existed. Prison employment records confirm he worked at Allegheny County Jail from 1881 to 1884. We know he left abruptly in late 1884. His resignation letter is on file, citing personal reasons. We know he spent his later years writing obsessively. Family members confirmed this. We know those writings described a giant prisoner and a dying confession. Multiple people read those journals before they vanished. What we can't prove is whether Robertson himself existed, whether the confession happened as described, whether any of it is true. But here's what makes the story compelling. The things Robertson supposedly told Whitmore in 1884 align with evidence that wouldn't be widely discussed for another 100 years. The mud flood theory, the World's Fair demolitions, the missing giant skeletons, the repurposed architecture. All of it matches patterns that independent researchers would later identify. Either Whitmore fabricated an elaborate story that just happened to predict future alternative history theories, or he recorded something true that powerful interests wanted buried. The Tartaria theory suggests a massive advanced civilization existed across Asia, Europe, and North America, a civilization that was destroyed or deliberately erased in the early 1800s, replaced with a new controllable narrative that made the survivors seem like the pinnacle of human achievement, rather than the inheritors of ruins. Giants would be direct evidence of this lost world, proof that humans were different before. Taller, stronger, built for a world with different conditions. Their existence alone would force questions about the timeline, about the official history, about who's really in control. So they had to go, not all at once. That would be too obvious. But gradually, quietly, arrest them on minor charges, keep them isolated, let them die in obscurity, destroy the evidence, seal the records. And in a generation or two, no one would remember they ever existed. Robertson's final message to Whitmore was simple: remember. Not to prove, not to convince, just to remember that the official story isn't the only story, that the world has been different before, and that the truth, no matter how buried, leaves traces. Those traces are everywhere if you know where to look. In the architecture that seems too grand for its stated purpose, in the foundations buried too deep, in the missing pages of history, in sealed records and disappeared evidence, in the giant skeletons that were found and then lost, in the cities that were built and demolished within months. The people who control the present understand that controlling the past gives them power over the future. If they can convince you that human civilization has only moved forward, never back, then you'll never question the idea that progress is inevitable, that what we have now is the best it's ever been. But what if it isn't? What if we're living in the ruins of something greater, told it's the height of achievement? What if the reset wasn't a natural disaster, but a deliberate restructuring? What if the giants weren't anomalies, but remnants? These questions can't be answered with certainty. Too much evidence has been destroyed, too many records sealed, too many witnesses silenced or discredited. The official history has been locked in place for over a century, and challenging it means facing ridicule, professional ruin, or worse. Samuel Whitmore died in 1914. He was 72 years old. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. His obituary made no mention of his time as a prison guard. His family buried his remaining papers with his body, fearing what might happen if they surfaced again. John Robertson, if that was ever his real name, exists now only in fragments. Scattered references, disputed accounts, the fading memories of researchers who have spent decades chasing ghosts through archives that don't want to be searched. But the story persists not because it can be proven, but because it asks the right questions, questions about what we've forgotten, what we've been told to forget, and what powerful interests have worked very hard to make sure we never remember. The last jail guard who fed a captive giant carried a secret to his grave. That secret wasn't about proving a conspiracy. It was about recognizing that history is written by those who survive. And sometimes what they write isn't the truth. It's just the version that lets them stay in power. You decide what to believe. But before you dismiss it entirely, look around your city. Look at the buildings that seem too large, the foundations too deep, the architecture too ornate for structures that are supposedly only 100 years old. Look at the old photographs and ask yourself if everything lines up the way they say it does. And remember that in 1884, a 9-foot-tall man died in a prison cell, and the people in charge made very sure you'd never know his name.